The Kansas City Chiefs, the Philadelphia Eagles, the San Francisco 49ers, and even the Los Angeles Rams have all done something that the Baltimore Ravens have been yet to do in more than a decade. What is that, you might ask? Visit the Super Bowl. What do those teams know about winning that the Baltimore Ravens have yet to figure out? Is it the GM? Is it the coach? Is it the QB play? Is it the roster construction? Can the Baltimore Ravens learn anything from those teams? Can they learn how to get over the proverbial hump? We discuss next on the GM. Welcome back to the GM. It is your guy, Boulanger. Up next, what can the Baltimore Ravens learn from winning teams? Let's talk. I refer to those four teams that I mentioned in the intro as winning teams, simply because they've done something that every team wants to do every year. No matter what your roster looks like, as a fan base, as a general manager, as a head coach, as a QB, as an offense, as a defense, you all want your team, or they all want their team, to get to the big show, the Super Bowl. It is an honor just being a participant, because that says you fought, scratched, claws, blood, sweat, tears all season long, 17 games, depending on what your seed is, concluding with about 20 games in total to get to that game. And the Chiefs have done it better than anybody over the last decade. But the Philadelphia Eagles are a close second. The 49ers, a close third, and the Rams have also done it. They've all been to the Super Bowl. They have all been to the Super Bowl, and 3 of the 4 have brought home a championship. And when I began to think about the Baltimore Ravens and what we're missing, when I began to think about the Baltimore Ravens and what we need, many things come to mind. Yesterday, I presented a video that said that the Baltimore Ravens needed to have vocal leaders who also lead with their play. But as I began to think about how these teams have gotten to multiple Super Bowls, listen to this craziness. They have gotten to multiple Super Bowls, and 3 of the 4 have won them. We haven't been to one. And we have an elite level QB. We have a long-term tenured coach, which many of you, as I say, is a part of that problem. We've had top-notch defenses, and we've yet to get the job done. See, we can say, well, we don't show up well in the playoffs. Okay, I can hear that. We can say coaching and play calling, and we should run the ball more, and we don't have an identity. And I can agree with that. But let's take a look at each of these teams and what they have been willing to do over the last decade, and identify some things at each level of ball, and see if we can diagnose some factors that the Baltimore Ravens need to begin to implement to get into some winning ways. Let's take a look at the Chiefs, who've been the best doing it over the last decade, right? The Chiefs basically bridge off of the Patriots' reign for 20 years, and they have started a 7 or 8 year reign of their own, visiting, I think this is their 5th Super Bowl and their 3rd title they've already clinched, hoping to clinch their 4th title. They've been the best to do it. But why? I think, number one, they've been aggressive when it comes to drafting. They've been aggressive when it comes to roster construction, and that starts at a general manager level. I think that when you look at each of these teams who have visited multiple Super Bowls, they've really out-GM'd the Baltimore Ravens. When you look at the Chiefs, they've been willing to flip players for picks, reduce cap space, move that money around, and continue to plug vital pieces into their roster to continue their winning ways. Let me give you an example. The Chiefs traded the Baltimore Ravens for Orlando Brown. Why? Because they needed a tackle. They put Orlando Brown in place, used him for a couple of years. They captured a championship, and then they let him walk for some draft compensation. On the heels of Orlando Brown leaving, they brought in a free agent offensive tackle, and they kept it moving, right? At the peak of Tyreek Hill's powers, this is all GM stuff. At the peak of Tyreek Hill's powers, they flipped him because he wanted more money, and he deserved more money, I guess. But they flipped him and replaced him, I think, with Rice, who has the potential to really be a really good wide receiver and be a number one type guy. They flipped him, plugged in some other holes, and continued their winning ways, capturing a Super Bowl after Tyreek Hill had departed and really hadn't missed a step since he has been gone. And with the money that they saved on paying Tyreek Hill, they could secure Chris Jones, who is the best standard bearer defensive tackle in the entire league, right? And keeping him allows everybody else along that defensive line to be better. They made timely free agent pickups to go along beside Chris Jones, and then in the draft they picked up George Karlaftis in the first round, a good pass rusher who has a good motor. He's not great, but he is definitely good with a good motor, and it just all works. They also drafted, here's the draft part, they also drafted Trent McDuffie in the first round, and he's been nothing short of great, being one of the best cornerbacks in the league since he walked in the door, right? More GM stuff. L'Jarius Sneed was a top cornerback last year. I won't say where he ranks amongst the best last year, but he was definitely a top cornerback in the league. But instead of signing him to a big time deal, they actually flipped him to the Tennessee Titans for some draft capital. They used that draft capital, some of it at least, and moved up into the first round to take the wide receiver that they had their eyes on, who was a speedy Xavier Worthy. How did that work out for them? Well, when you look at Xavier Worthy and his performance in the AFC Championship, he was the best wide receiver on the field for the Chiefs and also for the Bills. And that's GM work, right? When you look at the Philadelphia Eagles, who have visited 3 Super Bowls over the last decade, capturing one in the 2018-2019 season, I believe that's correct, or maybe it was 2017 to the 2018 season, but either way, in 2018, they won the Super Bowl. And they visited 2 more. How have they done that? I think Howie Roseman is the best GM doing it right now. He makes magic happen with his roster, his ability to recognize talent and get those talents in-house. How did Howie Roseman do it? Well, a smart GM makes sure he has a quality backup, which is what happened after they drafted Carson Wentz. Carson Wentz was playing very well in that almost MVP type season. He went down with an injury. Nick Foles stepped in and took this team to the Super Bowl and won it. Well, roster construction helped them win the Super Bowl. What do I mean by roster construction? You had guys on that defensive front, which is something that the Philadelphia Eagles continue to do, is make sure they have guys who can go get after the quarterback, both outside and inside. On that roster, if you remember, Brandon Graham was on that roster. I think Timothy Jurgen was on that roster. Derek Barnett was on that roster, and a host of other guys. And they took down the Patriots in that Super Bowl. Lo and behold, more GM work. They drafted Jalen Hurts in the second round. And once they saw that he was an adequate quarterback, he had a skill set to run the ball, that he had an ability to throw the ball downfield, what did they do? More GM work. They didn't play around with draft picks. They went out and got a guy in A.J. Brown who could complement what this offense needed, which was a big play wide receiver, while also having already drafted Devontae Smith, forming a really good tandem at the wide receiver position. And of course, if you know anything about Howie Roseman and the Eagles, they always build an offensive line, stockpiling talent, so that when one guy leaves, they have another guy who's ready to go and put in place. And that's how they end up going to the Super Bowl, with a really good offense and a solid but not great defense. Also, in that same time frame, they made a move to go get Darius Slay. They made sure they paid him to keep him in-house. They paid him again to keep him in-house. And what he does is play lights out football on one side of the field. Well, more GM work. They also go into the draft this past season, and they draft 2 corners, one in the first, one in the second round. They plug those 2 rookies in place in a role where they could be successful, and they did nothing but blossom in that Philadelphia Eagles defense. And not to mention, they do have one of, if not the best defensive tackle in the league in Jalen Carter. They've done nothing more than put other pieces around him like Nolan Smith, who continue to make life difficult for the passer. And so that's what they've done. Howie Roseman is a draft genius when it comes to eyeing talent, knowing what they want to do offensively, getting talent in-house, knowing what they want to do defensively, getting it in-house, and being willing to walk away from a player when their time is up. And so that's how the Philadelphia Eagles have ended up in 2 Super Bowls. Great GM work, whether it was free agency signing, trading draft capital to get players in that they need, and or hitting home runs in the draft. That's what the Chiefs and the Eagles have done, and you can see the results on field. Both teams have captured a Super Bowl in the last decade, and they both have visited multiple Super Bowls in the last decade. But let's not stop there. Let's go to the San Francisco 49ers. The 49ers have great GM work. John Lynch understands football and has an eye for talent. And there's many times where they're just hitting the mark when it comes to drafting, whether that was Brandon Ayuk, whether that was Deebo Samuel, whether that was DeForest Buckner, who they flipped to the Indianapolis Colts for some draft capital. I think they even got a first-round pick out of that. Whether it was Fred Warner, I don't know if he was there before John Lynch, but I know they made sure they kept him in-house. So they just continue to build the defense and continue to redevelop the offense, right? Hiring the right coach also plays a great part in GM work, making sure you got a guy who has an expert in something. Doesn't matter whether he's a offensive expert or a defensive expert, but having an expert in something. The last 2 guys who got hired, who come from a special teams context, they did not do well. John Harbaugh comes from a special teams context, and he doesn't always do well with game management and decision making and things of that nature. It's simply because he does not have an expert. He is an expert in football. He does have acumen in football, but whether it's offense or defense, he does not have an expertise, and it shows up multiple times. Let's set John Harbaugh to the side. So when you look at the San Francisco 49ers, what do? They kill it in the draft. They make sure they go get the guy who fulfills a role in the specific scheme of the offense. Look at Ricky Pearsall. Shout out to Pearsall for making it back from that gunshot wound to the chest. And late as he got healthy, got in the season, got into the rhythm, he was one of the best wide receivers on their roster. And so you just continue to see these guys, these general managers, perform very well, both in, again, free agency, in drafting, and in making timely trades, getting off of a guy when he needs to get off of a guy in order to keep building the necessary team. And you don't really see these teams overpay for anything, which is another Baltimore Ravens problem, which we will get to here in a second. Let's go to the LA Rams, who has also been to a Super Bowl with 2 different quarterbacks, capturing 1. I think their GM is named Les Snead, if I'm remembering correctly. He had a mentality several seasons ago, said, F those picks. What did that mean? That meant we're not just going to live in the world where we're just hoping to get cheap labor from draft capital and hope we can just find a way to win. No, they went out and got a Jalen Ramsey. They signed good veteran pass rushers. I don't remember their names at this point. And in order to kind of build up around Aaron Donald, who was the best defensive player in the league at that time for multiple seasons. See, it makes no sense to have a transcendent player and never really build around him. And so that's what the Rams did. They went out and got the parts that they needed in order to compete and win a championship. What did they do? Okay, they had a quarterback in Jared Goff who had already visited a Super Bowl, led by head coach McVay. But what they did was they flipped Jared Goff for an older veteran like Matthew Stafford, who had all the arm talent and who was thirsty and hungry for a Super Bowl. When they made the necessary trade, they went and captured the chip, right? And to be honest, they never really fell off. Even though he said F those picks and they didn't have first round picks for a couple of seasons, hey, you can live on a Super Bowl win for at least 2 seasons before your fan base gets in an uproar. And when that time period had passed, they were back to competing again. Good GM work, hitting on a 5th round pick like Puka, right? Hitting in this past draft, 2 rookies, Jared Verse, and I think it's Brian Fisk. I think I got his name right. I may be incorrect. Somebody correct me in the comment section if I got that name wrong. But nevertheless, hitting in the draft after losing a transcendent player like Aaron Donald. And that defensive pass rush was top notch. Jared Verse almost won the game in the divisional round, I think it was, by himself. Just continuing to put pressure on the quarterback over and over again after his running mate went out of the game. What am I saying? What am I saying? I'm simply saying that when you look at these winning teams who have been and also captured championships, which is exactly what we desire here in Baltimore, who don't have the caliber of quarterback that we have. Other than Patrick Mahomes, the quarterbacks on this list, they can't really see Lamar Jackson. But a lot of it begins with the general manager and the work that he does in free agency, in the draft, and in trading. Now let me get to the Baltimore Ravens general manager, Eric DeCosta, or EDC, if you will. My frustration with Eric DeCosta has been his inability to fill in the vulnerable areas that the Baltimore Ravens have, and also not really having the skill to pay people when they need to be paid and not pay those who do not need to be paid, right? Let's start with the draft and team building first. When you think about the draft, the Baltimore Ravens probably have had the most draft picks out of any team over the last 6 or 7 seasons, right? We definitely have to be top 2 or 3 because there's several seasons we've had 11 picks. We have 11 picks this season. And a lot of times we're doubling up on picks and hoping that these players kind of pan out. And maybe that's because our scouting department is lacking in some areas. Maybe EDC's ability to evaluate talent is lacking. I'm not sure. But to have the amount of draft picks that we have had and not really hit on some areas that have been super vulnerable, and they're still vulnerable to us, is a cause for concern, right? The Baltimore Ravens have had 3 vulnerable areas consistently over the last 7 seasons. Those vulnerable areas have been left guard. Those vulnerable places, I won't even say left tackle, only because you had a veteran guy in that position that they paid him, Ronnie Stanley. So you paid him with the expectation that he would be the long-term answer, and injuries kind of messed that up. So, but I will say the Baltimore Ravens had a concern at left guard, still have a concern at left guard. The Baltimore Ravens for at least 4 seasons had a concern at center. Finally got that answered in Tyler Lindenbaum at center. The Baltimore Ravens consistently had a issue at right guard, and it took signing Kevin Zeitler to fix that and then let him go, and he went out and performed well in another area. And then you had a right tackle who had the ability to play left tackle, but you trade him to a team that was already super successful and helped them go clinch another title. These things are not making a whole lot of sense. But when you look at the guys we actually drafted, right? When you look at Odafe and Rashad Bateman, both drafted in the same draft. Both of these guys have not really met expectation. I remember the conversation around Rashad Bateman, his route running, his hands, his speed, all those kind of things. And he has all those things, but injuries cut that short. And then the last year he played most of the season fairly healthy, and this year had his best season. Well, dadgum, it takes a first round pick 3 years to have 3 or 4 years to have his best season, right? That's too long for us. We can no longer wait for draft picks to develop, not while our Super Bowl window is open. You take Odafe Oweh, who was a first round pick. He has all the measurables, 6'4", 4'3" speed, quickness, speed, but he doesn't really make an impact as a dominant level edge rusher. And I know they don't grow on trees. I understand that, right? But that's an area we still have a vulnerability. Just like wide receiver depth is an area we still have vulnerability, and we have had for such a long time. When you think about the position of a cornerback, we've had to consistently make concession and trades to kind of craft a legitimate cornerback room. Remember, we had to go trade for Marcus Peters. Well, why we had to trade for Marcus Peters? Because we're not hitting in the draft. Then we had to trade in this past season for Tre'Davious White. Why are we doing that? Because we're not hitting on players in the draft. Another trade that we made to kind of fill a position to go back to edge rush, we traded for in Ndakwe, a 3rd round pick to the Minnesota Vikings, I believe, if I'm thinking correctly. Why? Because we're not hitting on those players in the draft. And so when you look at our edge room, if I can continue to speak on that, you look at a guy like Odafe, okay, double-digit sack, okay, he's good against the run. But Tavius Robinson may be a better version of what Odafe is going to be. Odafe, we may have already seen his peak in this past season. And if this is Odafe's peak, Tavius Robinson has the ability to give you the same thing at a lower price point. Now, am I saying get rid of Odafe? No, but if he could be included in a trade, I wouldn't blink, right? When you look at David Ojabo, a 2nd round pick, a guy you drafted who had a torn Achilles. Why? Because you like this fraternization that you do with Michigan because of the Harbaughs and who Jim Harbaugh knew and all these kind of things, and who you promised you would come get, and the Mike McDaniel connection, or the Mike McDonald connection, excuse me, right? He hasn't bust a grape in Baltimore. A 2nd round pick, a guy who you could have used to fill another position, but you're still waiting. And unfortunately, you may not ever see that 2nd round pick or the value of it come to pass in Baltimore. You drafted Adisa Isaac. Well, he's good value. He was a second round pick, but he fell to the third. No, he fell to the third because he was a third round pick. See, we get fooled by our scouting department and the experts who say that they're experts concerning the draft. Adisa Isaac was a third round pick because that's what he was supposed to be. And in fact, when you look at his ability to stay healthy and or his production, he should have been drafted in the fourth round. Right? And so when we're looking at these things, but we look at what other teams do with their rookies and their draft picks and how they draft strategically and put guys in a place to compete and win, we don't always do that. We're always waiting 3 or 4 years to see what a guy really can do. And that keeps us being vulnerable. And so when it comes to trading from the GM context, we've made several trades. Some of them have been good, but I think the worst trade we made was the Roquan Smith trade. Well, why would I say that? Well, because you gave up a second and a fifth for Roquan, and then you maxed him out. You made him the highest paid linebacker in the league. It doesn't matter how much you pay a linebacker and what you think he's worth. He's not worth no linebacker, not even Fred Warner, who is excellent, is never worth that kind of capital. A linebacker cannot become the highest paid player on your defense, especially the interior one, or you have trouble. The highest paid players on the defense most of the time should always be a top end edge rusher. J.J. Watt, Nick Bosa, at one point Joey Bosa, Brian Burns, at some point it's going to be Aiden Hutchinson. At some point, it's going to be Kayvon Thibodeau. Those kind of guys are the guys who get those $100+ million contracts. Now, Chris Jones is an interior defensive lineman, but he has proven multiple times that he is worth his money. Aaron Donald was an interior defensive lineman. He has proven multiple times he was worth his money. But then you trade for Roquan Smith, an interior defensive lineman, max him out, really translation, overpay him, and you're never going to get the value. And I know many people have come at me when I talked about Roquan before and said, well, Alonjay, you wrong on this. I'm not wrong on this. Where was Roquan's $100 million contribution this year? Name the splash play. Where was Roquan's $100 million game-changing play in the playoffs? Any snap. Name the snap. Matter of fact, if you want to, send me the clip of a Roquan Smith game-changing type play in the playoffs or in any of the playoffs, last year or this year. You don't have one because they don't exist. See, what happens with EDC is almost as if he gets scared and overplays his hand as if you're in some kind of bidding war. With Roquan Smith, he was bidding against himself. You know what? Slap a transitional tag on him, let him go test the market and see how that thing work out. Metabike, bidding against yourself. So these guys got paid, and then you don't see the production. And you've seen that time after time with EDC and his maximizing of contracts. So then you overpay in some areas and you stay thin in other areas. That's what makes this team vulnerable. That's why we lack wide receiver depth. That's why we lack offensive line talent. That's why we lack edge rush talent. That's why we lack linebacker talent. That's why we lack cornerback talent. Another guy, you go get, what's that dude's name? Marcus Williams. Max him out. Make him the highest paid safety in the league. And we get nothing from him. This is all on EDC. I'm not saying the Baltimore Ravens winning and losing is on EDC. I'm saying this roster construction and the areas that the Baltimore Ravens have remained thin, that is 100% on EDC and his scouting department that he clearly puts together or helps put together. And so if we can learn anything, from those teams who are doing it the best, the Chiefs, the Eagles, the 49ers, and the Rams, you got to nail it in the draft. Sometimes it's not about the volume of picks. It's about the quality of the pick. You have to move off of guys when it's time to move off of them. You have to be willing to flip a player in order to make room for another player. And the guys who need to be paid, pay them. And the guys that need to test the market, let them test the market. Here's the greatest travesty of EDC's career. Is when they played with Lamar Jackson's contract. Let me tell you how stupid this sounds when it comes to general managing. When you look at these best teams, there was never a thought that Patrick Mahomes would not be the quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs. There was never a thought that Jalen Hurts wouldn't be the quarterback for the Philadelphia Eagles. There was never a thought after they brought in Matthew Stafford that he wouldn't remain and continue to compete in the playoffs. And then there was never a thought that once they got The quarterback they had, Jimmy G, first. They was going to keep him because he had put them in a position to compete for a championship. Once they moved off of Jimmy G because of injuries and ineffectiveness, they got Brock Purdy. Right? That's a matter of being able to identify talent. They got Brock Purdy and he performed. And you see if Brock Purdy gets his deal this offseason. Now he might not get maxed out, but they're not going to move off of Brock Purdy. Right? But then you got Lamar Jackson, a guy who had already won an MVP. A guy you had never really given the requisite tools to be successful. Kept his head down and kept working. And every time he would get something reliable, you take it away from him. He had a reliable right tackle who could also play left tackle. What'd you do? You flipped him. You gave him to Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes won and won a championship with him. Right? You had a Marquise Hollywood Brown, right? A first round pick. He came off of his 1,000-yard season, but because of the style of the offense, he wanted out. What do? You flip your quarterback's best wide receiver. And you don't even replace him in the year that you flipped it. You see what I'm saying is, if you weren't going to build around him, at least don't play with his money. All of those other guys and many other guys, Trevor Lawrence got his money. No qualms about him getting paid. He ain't done half what Lamar Jackson's done. Justin Herbert got his money. No issue with it. There was never a thought that he wouldn't get paid. Josh Allen got his contract, I think 2 seasons before Lamar Jackson even got his first extension. But there was never a question. But you saw fit to put a transitional tag on Lamar Jackson to let him go test his value. But you wouldn't do that with a middle linebacker in Roquan Smith. You wouldn't do that with an interior defensive lineman in Metabike. But you would do that with your franchise quarterback. Man, see, that's the travesty. So let me know what you guys want me to know in the comment section. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What did I miss? I'm out.